last one day without asking a single question? In fact, could you last 5 minutes? Try it now. For the rest of this presentation, try not to ask a single question. And at the end, we'll see how many people have done it. It's actually surprisingly hard to do. Questions are an integral part of our everyday lives. We use them to learn, to communicate, to express ourselves, and to understand our world. They allow us to share common goals, establish common ground, and are a vital tool in our daily search for information. Whether that's understanding the quantum universe, or simply knowing the price of milk. What we ask, how we ask, and where, when, and who we ask determines a large proportion of what we come to know about the world around us and the people that we share it with. That's why questions matter, because what we know determines much of what we do. Surprisingly though, we know very little about questions themselves. What is a question? What do questions do, and why do we ask them? My research examines these questions and offers some philosophical answers to them. Today, I want to focus on just one of these. What is a question? As part of my research, I've been running a survey in order to try and capture an everyday understanding of questions. How do we apply this concept in our daily lives in order to identify when a question has been asked? The survey asked participants to read 10 short scenarios and decide whether or not there is a question in each. The scenarios revolve around the daily life of an imagined school teacher called Sarah, and each one is designed to test our natural intuitions about questions. So if you're willing, I'd like to try 3 of these out with you today. In each case, I'll read out the scenario and ask whether or not you think it contains a question. If you think it does, just raise your hand. Okay, here's the first scenario. Remember, our protagonist is a school teacher called Sarah. One of Sarah's colleagues is discussing with fellow teachers a lesson he's just given on countries of the world. During the discussion, Sarah realises that she doesn't know how many countries there are. Interested to know, she interjects saying, "How many countries are there?" And her colleagues respond with several different figures. In this scenario, was there a question? Yeah, okay. Most, perhaps, or not quite all, everyone. Okay, good. Well, of the survey participants, of which there have been over 5,000 to date, 95% said yes, there was a question in this case. Just 3% said no, and the remaining 2% were unsure. Here then, the intuitions are very clear. The scenario does contain a question. And in fact, that's just the result I'd expect. It does look like a clear case of question asking. Notice, though, that we're already learning something interesting about our everyday understanding of questions from this. Despite her best efforts, Sarah doesn't actually get the information she's after. Instead, her colleagues respond with several different figures. Nonetheless, most of us judge there to be a question in this case, which means that, intuitively, a question doesn't require an answer in order for it to be judged a question. That's an interesting feature of our everyday understanding of questions. Okay, let's try the second scenario. Sarah returns to her classroom and remembers that she's promised a friend who will be visiting that she'll find out where the nearest butcher's is to her house. Being a vegetarian, she's got no interest in this herself, but nevertheless, she types local Edinburgh butchers into Google and notes down the information. In this scenario, was there a question? Yes, so almost the same amount. Okay, good, most people. Of the survey participants, 72% said yes, there was a question in this case, 21% said no, and the remaining 7% were unsure. Here then, the intuitions are less clear. Many more people said no or were unsure than in the previous case. But 72% is still a compelling result. And this tells us a second interesting thing about questions. The phrase Sarah searches with, local Edinburgh butchers, doesn't have the standard linguistic form of an English question. It's not in the interrogative. Nonetheless, most of us judge there to be a question in this case, meaning that, intuitively, a question doesn't have to have a standard linguistic form in order to be judged a question. That is an interesting feature of our everyday understanding of questions. Okay, finally, let's try the third scenario. Sarah is trying a new route home from work. Along the route, she comes to the side of a busy, unfamiliar road with no pedestrian crossing. She looks both up and down the road to check if there are any vehicles coming, and then proceeds to cross safely. In this scenario, was there a question? So less, much more tentative, but still I'd say over half. Okay, good. So out of the survey participants, 66% said yes, there's a question, 28% said no, there isn't, and the remaining 6% were unsure. Here then again, the intuitions are even less clear. But a 2/3 majority is still a significant result. And this tells us a third interesting thing about our everyday understanding of questions. Sarah doesn't use any kind of spoken or linguistic expression at all in this scenario. Instead, she's just performing a familiar but non-linguistic act, looking both up and down the road. Despite this, with 2/3 judging there to be a question in this case, it looks like a question doesn't need to be expressed in words in order to be judged a question. So, what do we learn about questions from all of this? Well, it seems that, intuitively at least, a question is not determined by the need for an answer, it's not determined by any standard linguistic form, and it's not determined by its expression in words. When these are all put together, this tells us something really interesting, that our everyday understanding of questions is highly permissive. We judge many, many more things to be questions than we might have at first imagined. Which brings us back to my original challenge. And I'm genuinely fascinated to know how this turns out because I've never done it before. So if you have managed not to ask a single question in the last 5 minutes, please raise your hand. 4. Okay, so very few of you have resisted the urge to ask a question in the last 5 minutes. And for me, this tells us that understanding the nature of questions is both a fascinating and a valuable pursuit. It's only by understanding what questions are that we can begin to understand the central role that they play in our lives, in our intellectual pursuits, and in our education systems. And this is just one part of the story. Understanding the nature of questions, understanding why we engage in questioning and how we and our children and our students can become better questioners is the next exciting step for my research. So, thanks very much for taking part today. If you've got any more questions, then please feel free to come and talk to me, and you can complete the rest of the survey if you're interested at philosophyofquestions.com.